Dead weight. That's what a bad marriage looks like, ladies and gentlemen. Dead weight you carry for years until you're finally smart enough to put it down. 500 people laughed. Grant Holloway was still smiling when he pulled Madeline Cross against him at the podium, his hand firm on her waist, his eyes never once finding his wife standing 30 feet away in the crowd. Rebecca watched her husband hold another woman in front of every camera in that ballroom. She didn't scream, didn't collapse, didn't beg. She opened her purse, pulled out her phone, and made one single call, and in less than 15 minutes, Grant Holloway's entire world turned to ash. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The night had started cold, not unusually cold for Chicago in early November, but the kind of cold that settles into your bones before you even step outside, the kind that makes you question every decision that led you to standing on a sidewalk in a gown when you could have been home with a fire and a good book. Rebecca Holloway had almost stayed home. She had told herself that morning while Grant got dressed without speaking to her, while he checked his phone 4 times before finishing his coffee, while he kissed her on the cheek, the way a man kisses a doorframe on his way out. She had almost told herself to stay home, but something wouldn't let her. 6 years of marriage had given Rebecca a certain quiet instinct, the kind that develops when you spend enough time watching a person change and telling yourself the change isn't real. It's the instinct that wakes you up at 2 in the morning for no reason. The instinct that makes you reread a text message 3 times, even though the words look perfectly ordinary. The instinct that had been sitting in her chest for nearly a year, quiet and patient and increasingly impossible to ignore. That instinct told her to go to the gala, so she went. She wore the midnight blue gown she had bought 2 years ago for a dinner they had attended together back when Grant still reached for her hand in public, back when he still introduced her to people, as though her presence added something to a room rather than subtracted from it. She didn't wear the heavy diamond necklace he had given her on their 4th anniversary. She wore something simple, a delicate pearl drop her mother's, because Rebecca had always preferred things that mattered over things that impressed. The drive to the lakefront hotel took 23 minutes. She spent most of it looking out the window at the city lights reflecting off the lake, and she spent the rest of it telling herself that she was being paranoid, that Grant was a busy man, that marriages went through seasons and theirs was simply in a difficult one, and difficult seasons ended. She had been telling herself that for 11 months. She stopped telling herself when she reached the registration table. The young woman behind it, late 20s, efficient, clearly trained to handle awkward situations with maximum professionalism, ran her finger down the list twice. Then she looked up at Rebecca with the specific expression of someone who has been handed a problem they didn't create. "Mrs. Holloway," the coordinator said carefully, "I'm so sorry. Your name doesn't appear to be on the guest list." Rebecca blinked. "That's not possible. My husband is a sponsor. Grant Holloway Urban Development." "Yes." The coordinator's voice dropped half a register. "Mr. Holloway's invitation does include a +1. She paused, and in that pause, Rebecca understood that something was coming that she wasn't going to like. "The +1 is registered under the name Madeline Cross." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Rebecca had heard that name before. Not from Grant. Never from Grant. She had heard it the way you hear things you aren't supposed to hear, a voicemail accidentally played on speaker before he grabbed the phone, an email preview on his laptop screen when he left the room, a charge on a credit card statement for a restaurant she had never been invited to. Madeline Cross, Grant's communications director. Rebecca stood at that registration table for a moment that felt much longer than it was, and she made a decision. Not an angry decision, not an impulsive one, the kind of decision that comes when something inside you simply finishes waiting. "I appreciate you letting me know," she told the coordinator quietly. Then she walked inside anyway. She didn't make a scene at the door. She simply moved past the registration table with the confidence of a woman who knew how to enter a room, and nobody stopped her, because people who know how to carry themselves in spaces like that are rarely questioned. The ballroom was everything the Lakefront Hope Foundation intended it to be. Gold light, long tables draped in white, the low murmur of powerful people in expensive clothes performing the particular social ritual of philanthropic Chicago, the hand on the shoulder, the meaningful eye contact, the practiced laughter, the quiet exchange of information, worth more than any of the auction items displayed along the east wall. Rebecca moved through the room slowly. She was looking for Grant. She found him in less than 4 minutes. I was standing near the bar with a glass of bourbon in one hand and his other hand resting at the small of a woman's back. The woman was tall, red-dressed, and laughing at something Grant had said, with the ease of someone who had laughed at his jokes many times before in private. Her hand rested on his arm, not the arm of a man she worked for, the arm of a man she was comfortable touching in public. Madeline Cross was exactly as beautiful as Rebecca had imagined. Younger, polished. The specific kind of polished that requires both money and effort and the confidence to spend both without apology. She wore her hair up, and she tilted her head when she laughed, and she didn't move her hand when one of Grant's business acquaintances joined their conversation. She was behaving like his partner, not his employee, not his guest, his partner. Rebecca stood 15 feet away and watched the man she had married pour himself into someone else's laughter, and she felt something move through her that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger. It was something older and quieter than both the specific ache of finally seeing something clearly that you had been squinting at for a very long time. She walked toward them. Grant saw her first, and the expression on his face when he saw her told Rebecca everything she needed to know. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't surprise, it was irritation. Pure, flat, unconcealed irritation, the look of a man who has been interrupted by something he considers an inconvenience. Rebecca. He said her name the way people say a word they've lost patience with. Not with warmth, not with embarrassment, with impatience. What are you doing here? I'm your wife, Rebecca said. I'm here for the gala. I didn't put you on the list. I noticed. Madeline stood beside him with a small, careful smile that never quite reached her eyes. She extended her hand to Rebecca with the practiced grace of a woman who had prepared for exactly this moment. Madeline Cross, I handle communications for Grant's company. I know who you are, Rebecca said, and she shook the woman's hand because she had been raised to do that, because her mother had taught her that composure was not weakness, that the ability to hold yourself together when everything is falling apart is not the same thing as having nothing to say. She had things to say. She simply chose when. Before she could say any of them, the gala host's voice cut across the room from the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, we have a very special presentation this evening. The Lakefront Hope Foundation is proud to present its Humanitarian Leadership Award to one of Chicago's most dynamic developers, Grant Holloway of Holloway Urban Development. The room applauded. Grant's irritation vanished, immediately replaced by the version of himself he performed for audiences. The broad shoulders, the easy smile, the particular way he moved when he knew people were watching, as though the room had been built for him to walk through it. He handed Madeline his bourbon glass without looking at her, and she took it without needing to be asked, and that small, unconscious transaction told Rebecca more than a year of suspicion had managed to confirm. Grant walked toward the stage, and Rebecca watched him go. She stood in that ballroom, the wife who hadn't been invited, the woman whose name had been replaced on the guest list, and she watched her husband climb the steps to the stage and accept a microphone and smile at 500 people who had no idea what had just happened 30 feet from the bar. "Thank you," Grant said, surveying the room with the ease of someone who genuinely enjoyed being looked at. "You know, moments like this make you stop and think about the journey, the sacrifices, the choices." Polite laughter, the kind that expensive venues produce naturally. "Building something real," Grant continued, "requires the right people around you. And I think we all know in business and in life that dead weight is the one luxury no one can actually afford." More laughter. Rebecca felt the words land. She recognized that phrase. Dead weight. Grant had used it before in arguments at home, always in the context of explaining why certain people in his life weren't contributing at their level. He had used it about employees, about competitors. She had never imagined he would use it on a stage in a crowd of 500 with her standing in the room. But he wasn't finished. "I want to take a moment," Grant said, his voice settling into something more deliberate, "to recognize someone who has actually stood beside me while I built something. Someone who understood the work. Someone who contributed every single day to making Holloway Urban Development what it is today." He looked out into the room. He found Madeline Cross, my communications director, my strategist, and frankly, the person who kept this company's story straight when I was too buried in the work to tell it myself. The applause was genuine. People knew Madeline. She was visible, polished, effective. She had placed Grant's face on covers and his quotes in magazines, and his name in conversations where it wouldn't otherwise have appeared. She deserved credit for her professional work. But the way Grant said it, the weight he gave the words, the length of eye contact he held with her across the room, transformed a professional acknowledgement into something else entirely. Something that more than a few people in that ballroom recognized immediately. Rebecca didn't look at Grant. She looked at the faces around her. She saw the glances, the raised eyebrows, the quiet lean of one person toward another, the specific choreography of a room that has just collectively understood something the person at the center of it hasn't said out loud. Several guests near her were already pulling out phones. When Grant finished his speech and descended from the stage, Rebecca was waiting for him. "Grant." Her voice was quiet, even. "I need to speak with you." He barely broke stride. "Not right now, Rebecca." "Yes," she said. "Right now." He stopped, looked at her, and the version of him that performed for audiences was still running because there were people nearby, because the cameras from a local lifestyle publication were still in the room, because Grant Holloway was always aware of who was watching. "You're making a scene," he said, voice low. "I haven't said anything yet," Rebecca replied. Madeline appeared at his side, and later people who were close enough would remember that she didn't look uncomfortable. She looked composed, prepared, the way a person looks when they've rehearsed for a moment. "Rebecca," Grant said, "I don't know why you came tonight, but this isn't the place." "You removed me from the guest list," Rebecca said. "Your wife. You removed me and put her name instead. Keep your voice down." "I am keeping my voice down. I'm asking you a question." A short silence. Nearby conversations dimmed slightly. The natural acoustics of social attention when something real happens inside a performance space, the room adjusts. Grant exhaled. Something shifted in his expression. Later, Rebecca would think that this was the moment she saw the marriage end, not in anger, not in tears, but in the specific look of a man who has simply stopped pretending. "Our marriage is finished, Rebecca." He said it the way he might say a meeting had been rescheduled. Flat, final, inconvenient, but already decided. "I've been trying to find the right time to tell you properly. This isn't it. But since you've come here tonight and created this situation, I created this situation." "Yes." No apology in his voice, no softening. "I want a divorce. It's been over for a long time. You know that as well as I do." Before Rebecca could respond, Madeline tilted her head slightly and said in a voice she made no effort to lower, "Maybe some women are simply meant to watch successful people from the sidelines." 3 people standing within earshot heard her clearly. One of them laughed. It was a short laugh, quickly suppressed, the kind that escapes before the person realizes they've made a mistake. But it was real, and Rebecca heard it, and she felt it move through her, the way small cruelties move through a person who has learned not to flinch from them. She looked at Madeline. She looked at Grant. And then she looked at the man she had married 6 years earlier in a quiet ceremony that had made her mother nervous and her brother skeptical, and she looked at him with the particular clarity that comes when you finally stop hoping something isn't true. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't conflicted. He was waiting for her to leave. For the first time in a long time, Rebecca Holloway felt the last of her patience leave her body. Not explosively. There was no dramatic moment, no tears on her cheeks, no raised voice. She was her mother's daughter, and her mother had taught her that a woman's greatest power was in the dignity of her composure. She simply finished. She turned away from both of them and walked toward an empty table near the east wall, away from the noise, away from the cameras, away from the auction items and the charity speeches and the 500 people who were now slowly beginning to notice that something had happened near the bar. She sat down. She reached into her purse. She took out her phone. Her hands were steady. She noticed that. She had expected them to shake, and they didn't, and she thought that meant something, though she wasn't sure what. She scrolled to her brother's name, Alexander. She pressed call. It rang once. "Rebecca." His voice was immediate. Present. Not the voice of a person who had been asleep or distracted. The voice of someone who had been waiting. "Alex." She paused. The sounds of the gala moved around her music voices, the particular din of expensive social obligation. She looked at the tablecloth in front of her. White linen, a small card with the foundation's logo, a centerpiece she didn't look at. "I'm ready to come home." There was a silence. Not a long silence, not a confused one, a silence that meant something had been understood. "We're already outside," Alexander said, and he hung up. Rebecca set the phone down on the table. She didn't look toward where Grant and Madeline were standing. She didn't check to see who was watching her. She didn't fix her hair or straighten her gown or perform the small, instinctive repairs that women make to their appearance after humiliation. The reaching for a mirror, the blink to clear the eyes, the lifted chin that says, "I'm fine," when nothing is fine. She simply sat. And in that stillness, in the white noise of a ballroom that didn't know yet what was about to walk through its doors, Rebecca Holloway breathed. She thought about 6 years. She thought about the woman she had been before Grant, the version of herself she had deliberately set aside because she wanted something no amount of money or family name had ever given her. She had wanted to be loved for exactly who she was, with no context, no portfolio, no empire standing behind her, adding weight to the reasons someone might choose her. She had wanted a simple marriage. She had gotten one, simpler than she had imagined in the end. She had loved him. That was the part that didn't get easier, even when everything else became clear. She had genuinely, completely loved him. The man who had pursued her in the early years with a curiosity that felt real. The man who had sat across from her at a restaurant table in their first year and asked her what she actually believed about things, not what she owned, not what she came from, not where she was going, what she actually believed. The man who had told her once that she was the first person he'd met who made him want to be better rather than bigger. She had believed him. That was the part she was still learning to let go of. She didn't know exactly how long she sat there, long enough for the room to shift slightly around her. The post-award energy, settling back into normal gala rhythm, people moving toward the auction table servers, circling with champagne. Long enough for the moment at the bar to fade slightly in other people's minds, to become a small incident rather than the main event of the evening. Long enough for the doors at the east end of the ballroom to open. Rebecca noticed the shift before she understood the cause. It happened in the specific way that collective attention moves in a crowd, not like a wave but like a tilt, a slight reorientation, heads turning, conversations pausing mid-sentence, the sound of the room dropping half a register as people noticed something and began calibrating whether it was worth fully noticing. Then she saw them. 2 private security officers entered first. Behind them came a woman she recognized, Clara Mendez, one of Whitmore Holdings' senior legal counsel, in a black blazer that meant she had arrived from work directly rather than home. Behind Clara came 3 men in suits who were not Whitmore employees, but who moved the way Whitmore people moved with the particular efficiency of those who had learned to operate in spaces where time has quantifiable value. And behind all of them came Alexander. Her brother had always been difficult to describe in terms that didn't sound theatrical because the effect he produced in rooms wasn't manufactured. It wasn't performance. It was the accumulated weight of a person who has spent decades making decisions that matter and living with the consequences of all of them, good and terrible both. He was tall in the way that leadership sometimes adds to a person's physical presence, not in inches, but in the way space arranged itself around him. Howe was 56 and looked exactly like it, not old, not young, but someone for whom age had sharpened rather than softened every quality he'd ever had. He scanned the room the way he scanned everything, efficiently, completely, and when his eyes found Rebecca at her table near the east wall, something crossed his face that she had very rarely seen there. Not triumph, not anger, something that looked almost like relief. He moved through the room without stopping. Several people attempted to intercept him. 2 of them were recognizable names in Chicago, finance people who would have considered a brief word with Alexander Whitmore the professional highlight of a gala evening. He acknowledged them with the absolute minimum that courtesy required and kept moving. He was almost to her table when Grant noticed him. Rebecca watched Grant's face from across the room as her husband tracked Alexander's trajectory. She watched the confusion assemble itself on Grant's features. She watched him turn to Madeline and say something. She watched Madeline shake her head slightly, she didn't know either. And then she watched Alexander stop in front of her table and look at her with the expression of a man who is choosing his words very carefully because this is not the place to say the ones he actually means. "Rebecca," he said. "Alex," she answered. And he bent down and held her right there in the middle of the Lakefront Hope Foundation Gala, with 500 people recalibrating their understanding of the evening in real time. He held her the way a brother holds a sister he has missed, not briefly, not performatively, but with the particular fullness of someone who has been waiting for a long time to do this, and is not going to rush it simply because people are watching. When he straightened, his face had cleared into something more familiar, composed, ready. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Tell me what happened," he said. "Quickly. I know most of it, but I want to hear it from you." He announced the divorce in front of the room, Rebecca said. During his award speech, he made a joke about dead weight. Then he introduced Madeline as the person who actually stood beside him. Alexander's expression didn't change visibly, but something around his jaw tightened. In front of 500 people. "Yes. Did Madeline say anything to you directly?" "She said maybe some women are meant to watch successful people from the sidelines." A pause. "Was it heard?" "3 people nearby. One of them laughed." Alexander was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. She counted them. "All right," he said. "Are you ready?" Rebecca thought about the question. She had spent 6 years choosing quiet, choosing ordinary, choosing a version of herself that asked nothing from the world except to be loved plainly. She had made that choice with full knowledge of what she was setting aside, and she had made it freely, and she didn't regret it even now, even sitting in this ballroom with Grant's words still in the room around her. But the choice she had made 6 years ago was not the choice she needed to make tonight. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." Alexander nodded once. He stood. He took out his phone, pressed a single contact, and said 2 words, "She's ready." And across the room near the main entrance of the ballroom, the doors opened again. This time the entire room stopped, because the woman who walked through those doors hadn't attended a public charity event in nearly 3 years. The Lakefront Hope Foundation had sent Margaret Whitmore an invitation, as they did every year as a gesture of respect rather than genuine expectation. She gave generously from a distance. She had no particular interest in gala atmospheres. She had survived enough of them. But she was here tonight. 73 years old, small in physical stature in the way that certain people are small, not diminished by it, but concentrated by it, as though all of the force that might have been distributed across greater height had been compressed into a more immediate radius. She wore charcoal, a single piece, nothing elaborate. She didn't need elaborate. Margaret Whitmore had spent 50 years becoming the kind of person that rooms went quiet for, and she hadn't done it through jewelry or event coordination or the careful management of other people's impressions. She'd done it by knowing at every moment of her life exactly who she was and refusing to apologize for it. She moved through the ballroom without pausing. People opened a path for her the way people do, for forces of nature, not dramatically, not consciously, but because it was simply the appropriate physical response to the thing moving toward you. She stopped in front of Rebecca. She looked at her daughter for a long moment, not at her gown, not at her posture, not at the table or the phone Rebecca had placed face down on the white linen or the empty champagne glass a server had left nearby. At her. 6 years was long enough, Margaret said. Rebecca looked at her mother. "Yes," she said softly. "It was." Something moved across Margaret's face, not quite an emotion, but the faintest release of one, the kind that only appears on the face of someone who has been waiting a very long time to hear something and has finally heard it. She turned to Alexander. "Then announce it," she said. Alexander straightened. He moved toward the foundation chairman, a man named Douglas Farrell, who ran the Lakefront Hope Foundation, with meticulous attention to donor relationships, and was therefore extremely interested in whatever was happening to his gala right now. Grant had crossed the room. I was standing 12 feet away, close enough to hear far enough that he hadn't yet decided whether to approach. Madeline was beside him, her hand no longer on his arm, her smile no longer present. She was watching Alexander with the expression of someone rapidly reassessing a situation. Alexander looked toward Grant, once a brief look purely informational, and then spoke to Douglas Farrell in a voice that carried. "I want to take a moment," Alexander said, "to correct something. I realize introductions weren't made properly this evening. The woman sitting at that table," he gestured toward Rebecca, "is Rebecca Ann Whitmore, my sister, and one of the 2 principal beneficiaries of the Whitmore Family Trust." The room inhaled. It wasn't a dramatic sound. It was the very specific sound of 500 people simultaneously updating information. Grant's face went still, completely still. The kind of still that happens to a person when the ground shifts beneath them and they haven't yet begun to fall. Madeline said something to him quietly. He didn't respond. He was looking at Rebecca. Rebecca, sitting at her table near the east wall, did not look at him. She looked at her mother, who had turned back toward her, and Margaret Whitmore extended her hand. An old-fashioned gesture, deliberate. Rebecca took it, and she stood up. And for the first time in 6 years, she stopped making herself small. Alexander wasn't finished. Before marrying Mr. Holloway 6 years ago, he continued, his voice measured and precise. Rebecca held an executive position within Whitmore Holdings and was being prepared for senior leadership. She made the decision to step back from that role because she wanted something none of us could give her: a marriage based on who she was, rather than what our family name was worth. A pause that the entire room filled with silence. She is returning to Whitmore Holdings effective immediately. Her executive authority, which has been suspended at her own request for the past 6 years, is fully reinstated. He looked out at the room. "I wanted people to know," he said simply, "because some things deserve to be said clearly." And the room, the same room that had laughed at Grant Holloway's joke 25 minutes earlier, sat with that. Grant Holloway stood 12 feet away, and he stood very, very still, because the man had spent 6 years telling himself that his wife had nothing to offer except what he gave her. And the ground he had been standing on for 6 years had just opened beneath his feet. He was only beginning to understand how far he was about to fall. Grant Holloway had not moved from the spot where Alexander's words had found him. He stood 12 feet from Rebecca's table with a glass of bourbon he had forgotten he was holding, and he looked at his wife, the woman he had publicly discarded 40 minutes ago, standing beside her mother and her brother with the quiet stillness of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment to arrive. The room around him was doing the thing rooms do when information restructures itself inside a crowd. Not chaos, not noise. Something more unsettling than either of those, the low hum of 500 people simultaneously recalculating. Madeline put her hand on Grant's arm. "Grant." Her voice was low, careful. "Say something to me. Tell me you knew about this." He didn't answer her. She squeezed his arm harder. "Grant, did you know who she was?" "No," he said, and his voice came out flat, like something that had lost its shape. "I didn't know." Madeline pulled her hand back slowly. She looked across the room at Rebecca Whitmore, and the expression on Madeline's face shifted through several things very quickly. Disbelief, then calculation, then something that might have been the early stages of fear. "Rebecca Whitmore," she said quietly, as though the name itself needed testing. "As in Whitmore Holdings." "Yes," Grant said. "The infrastructure group, the freight logistics, the me, yes, Madeline." A short silence between them that held a great deal of weight. "How long were you married to her?" Madeline asked, and the question sounded different now than it would have sounded an hour ago. It sounded like a woman asking how long she had been standing on ground she didn't know was hollow. 6 years, Grant said. Madeline Cross, who had built an entire professional identity on knowing things before other people knew them, who had made her career on information and timing and the precise management of narrative Madeline Cross, had nothing to say to that. She set his bourbon glass on the nearest table and walked away. Grant barely noticed. He was watching Alexander Whitmore move through the room. Not toward him. Not yet. Alexander was working the space the way powerful people work a space, not performing, not glad-handing, but making deliberate contact, quiet word by quiet word with the specific people in that room whose opinions would travel the farthest by morning. He spoke to Douglas Farrell for 90 seconds, and Farrell nodded twice and wrote something on the back of a program card. He put his hand briefly on the shoulder of a man Grant recognized as a senior partner at the largest commercial real estate law firm in Illinois. He exchanged 4 words with a woman near the auction tables, who Grant knew with a sinking certainty was the deputy chair of the Regional Infrastructure Investment Commission. He wasn't making small talk. He was doing damage control for Rebecca. And in doing so, he was efficiently, methodically, without raising his voice or changing his expression, dismantling every piece of the narrative Grant had been constructing for the past 6 years. Grant set his own glass down. He straightened his jacket, and he crossed the room toward his wife. He had to pass 3 separate groups of people who went quiet when he approached and found things to look at that weren't him, and he registered each of those small silences, the way you register small cuts not deeply but repeatedly and with a cumulative effect. Rebecca was standing with her mother. Margaret Whitmore had produced from somewhere a glass of still water, and she was holding it with both hands and watching her daughter with the expression of someone who has been watching someone they love make a difficult journey and has finally seen them reach the other side of it. She looked in that moment less like a billionaire matriarch and more simply like a mother. Grant had never met her before. He realized, standing 10 feet away, that this fact, which had seemed unremarkable for 6 years, was actually one of the most significant things Rebecca had ever kept from him. Not maliciously, purposefully, Rebecca had looked up when he was still 8 feet away. She had the particular awareness of someone who has spent a year monitoring exits. "Grant," she said. "Rebecca." He reached her and stopped, and he was aware of people nearby adjusting their positions slightly, the choreography of a crowd that wants to witness something without appearing to do so. He lowered his voice. "I need to speak with you, privately." "This seems fine," Rebecca said. "Rebecca, say what you want to say, Grant." He looked at Margaret Whitmore, who looked back at him with the serene patience of someone who has watched a great many men underestimate the women in their family and has long since stopped being surprised by it. Grant looked back at Rebecca. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. And he heard even as he said it that the question was wrong, that it was the wrong question and the wrong tone and the wrong approach entirely. But he was a man standing on the edge of an understanding he hadn't been prepared for, and the words were already out. Rebecca tilted her head slightly. "Tell you what specifically? Who you are? What your family?" He stopped, tried again. "Rebecca, you let me believe." "I let you believe I was a woman who loved you," she said. "That was true. Everything else you believed about me you decided on your own. You have to understand that changes things." "For you," Rebecca said, "it changes things for you. For both of us." "No." Her voice remained even, quiet. The kind of quiet that is more damaging than volume because it contains no room for negotiation. "For 6 years, the person I was didn't change things for you at all. I was the same person 6 years ago that I am standing here right now. You made a decision about what I was worth based on what you could see. That's not something I kept from you. That's something you did." Grant's jaw tightened. "I made a mistake tonight. In the speech. I got caught up." "You kissed her in front of me," Rebecca said. The words were short. They hit cleanly. "On the cheek," Grant said, and he heard immediately how that sounded. "In front of 500 people, after calling your marriage dead weight, after introducing her as the woman who actually stood beside you." Rebecca paused. "What part of that was getting caught up, Grant?" Margaret Whitmore turned slightly away, as though she had heard enough of this particular conversation. She raised 2 fingers toward Alexander, who was 30 feet away, and he excused himself from the conversation he was in and began moving toward them. Grant saw him coming. "Rebecca," he said, and his voice dropped another register into something that was trying to locate urgency without tipping into desperation. "I'm asking you to wait. Before this goes any further, before Alexander does whatever he's planning to do. Wait, talk to me." "I've been talking to you for 6 years," she said. "I mean, really talk. I did that too." She looked at him steadily. "You weren't listening. That's not the same as me not speaking." Alexander arrived. He stood beside Rebecca with the ease of a man who has arrived exactly where he intended to be, and he looked at Grant Holloway with an expression that was entirely unreadable, not hostile, not triumphant, not angry, simply present, the way a wall is present. "Mr. Holloway," Alexander said. "Alexander." Grant extended his hand because he was a man who understood the tactical value of physical courtesy. "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding," Alexander said. He didn't take the hand immediately. "Is that the word you were looking for?" "There are things I didn't know," Grant said, "about your family's connection to my wife." "You mean about who your wife is," Alexander said. "Not your family's connection to her. Her." Grant lowered his hand. Alexander studied him for a moment, with the particular attention of someone who spends a great deal of time evaluating whether a person is worth their time. Then he said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it fully." "All right," Grant said. "Whitmore Capital holds a 41% stake in the Municipal Financing Coalition behind the Riverfront South redevelopment project." He paused to let that number settle. "The project your company is currently in the 4th month of pre-construction planning for. The project for which you submitted a revised capital proposal to the City Board last Thursday." Grant did not move. The financing review period closes in 18 days, Alexander continued, at which point the coalition votes on whether to proceed with the existing development partnership or to restructure. The bourbon Grant had been drinking for the last 2 hours turned cold in his stomach. I wasn't aware, Grant said carefully, that Whitmore Capital was involved in that coalition. You weren't looking, Alexander said simply. A silence. Then Grant said the only thing he could think to say, "What happens to the project?" Alexander looked at his sister. Rebecca looked at Grant. And then Rebecca said with no heat and no satisfaction and no particular emphasis at all, "That's not something I'm thinking about tonight, Grant." She turned back toward her mother. And Grant Holloway understood in the way that a man understands things when the scaffolding around his life begins to move that the conversation was over. He stood there for 3 more seconds. Then he walked back across the ballroom past the auction tables and the champagne servers and the quiet groups of people who watched him pass and said nothing, and he sat down alone at a table near the west wall and he tried to think. The Riverfront South project was the biggest development deal of his career. $47 million in financing, 3 years of groundwork, a city council relationship. He had spent a decade building toward this exact opportunity, Whitmore Capital. He had never once thought to look at who was behind the coalition. He hadn't thought to look because he hadn't thought it mattered. He hadn't thought it mattered because he hadn't thought Rebecca mattered. The logic of that chain assembled itself in his mind with the horrible clarity of something obvious. Meanwhile, 40 feet away, something was happening that he couldn't hear but could see with complete and devastating precision. Margaret Whitmore had taken her daughter's face gently in both hands. She said something. Rebecca closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them, and she nodded. And Margaret stepped back, and Rebecca stood up straight, not performatively, not for the room, but with the specific straightening of a person who has been carrying something at an angle for a long time and has finally set it down properly, and the two of them walked together toward the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted, not dramatically, not with fanfare, the way a crowd parts for something that has earned the space. Douglas Farrell, the foundation chairman, was already at the podium. He had been there for approximately 4 minutes, rearranging notes. He didn't need to rearrange because Alexander had spoken to him earlier, and he was prepared. "Ladies and gentlemen," Farrell said, "I want to take one additional moment before we move to our live auction. It's not often that an evening like this one includes a genuine surprise, but I think everyone in this room will agree that tonight has been exceptional in more than one respect." A ripple of energy moved through the crowd, laughter, attention. "I'm honored to acknowledge," Farrell continued, "the return to public life of a woman who has been, by her own choice, absent from this kind of room for some years. Many of you know the Whitmore family through their extraordinary contributions to infrastructure community development and environmental investment across this country. Tonight we welcome back one of that family's most formidable members, Rebecca Whitmore, who will be resuming her role as a principal executive of the Whitmore Family Trust, and the Whitmore Community Investment Initiative is here tonight. And on behalf of this foundation, I want to say we are very glad she is." The applause was immediate. Not polite applause, real applause, the kind that comes from a room full of people who understand that something they're witnessing matters, even if they aren't entirely certain yet of all the reasons why. Rebecca stood in the center of that ballroom and received it. She didn't smile the smile of a woman performing gratitude. She didn't tilt her head modestly or wave or deflect. She simply stood, and she let the recognition be real because she had spent 6 years deciding that needing recognition was vanity, and she was finished deciding that. Accepting what you have earned is not the same as needing approval. She understood that now. Grant watched from his table near the west wall. And for the first time in a very long time, possibly the first time in their marriage, he saw his wife completely. Not the version of her he had assembled from what she allowed him to see. Not the quiet woman at the edge of his life who managed the house and listened to his work stories and never asked for more than he chose to give. I saw Rebecca Whitmore standing in the center of the Lakefront Hope Foundation Gala, receiving a standing ovation from 500 of Chicago's most powerful people, with her 73-year-old mother beside her and her brother 3 steps back and her chin exactly level. And he felt the specific terror of a man who has thrown something away without checking whether it could be replaced. He stood up. I was going to go to her again. He had to go to her again. He had to say something that wasn't wrong, something that cut through the public machinery of the moment and reached her, the real her, the woman he had woken up next to 6 years of mornings, Mr. Holloway. He stopped. The voice belonged to Clara Mendez, Whitmore Holdings' senior legal counsel. She was standing 2 feet to his left, and she was holding a folder, and the expression on her face was the expression of a professional delivering information she has already delivered in much more difficult situations and has long since stopped feeling personally about. "Ms. Mendez," Grant said, "I don't believe we've been introduced." "We haven't," she agreed. "But I've been aware of your work for some time now. I want to speak with you about the Riverfront South project if you have a moment." "This isn't," he glanced toward Rebecca, "this isn't a good time." "I understand," Clara said, "but I want to be sure you understand something before the evening ends because it will affect your schedule significantly." She opened the folder. Whitmore Capital's participation in the Riverfront South Financing Coalition was structured through 3 separate holding entities, which is why it didn't appear in the initial partnership disclosure documents your legal team reviewed. That was not an accident, though. It also wasn't designed specifically in response to tonight. We became aware of certain financial irregularities in Holloway Urban Development's project accounts approximately 7 weeks ago. Grant went very still. "What kind of irregularities?" he said. It was not a question. His voice had lost the quality of questions. "The kind that suggest company capital has been used for personal expenditures that weren't disclosed to your board," Clara said. "Restaurant charges, hotel rooms, a lease on a property in River North that doesn't appear in any corporate filing." She paused. "Some of those expenses correlate with Ms. Cross's records." Grant looked at her. "We weren't looking for this," Clara said, and her voice was entirely without judgment, which somehow made it worse. "Mrs. Holloway, Rebecca contacted her brother approximately 2 months ago, not about the affair. She had noticed some documents while helping you organize paperwork at home. She recognized transactions that didn't look right. She asked Alexander to have someone look." Grant thought about 2 months ago. "I thought about a Tuesday evening when Rebecca had been helping him clear paperwork from his home office desk because he had a board meeting the next morning and couldn't find the revised contractor agreements. She had been quiet and helpful and efficient, the way she was always quiet and helpful and efficient, and he had been impatient with her because he was stressed about the meeting and because he had stopped seeing her clearly years before that. She had seen something in those papers. She had recognized something, and she had said nothing to him. She had called her brother. She didn't try to use it against me," Grant said slowly. "No," Clara agreed. "She sat on it for 2 months." "She sat on it," Clara said, "and she asked her brother to investigate quietly, and she waited to see what he found. She wasn't building a case against you. She was trying to understand whether what she saw was what she thought it was." "And was it?" Clara closed the folder. "Our forensic team found enough to warrant a formal referral to regulatory oversight. We're not in a position to suppress that, Mr. Holloway. The evidence exists independently of tonight. Your behavior this evening is not what caused this. But it's what ended her protecting me from it," Grant said. Clara looked at him with the first genuine human expression she had allowed herself all evening. "I think," she said carefully, "that she stopped protecting you from it the moment you told her the marriage was over in front of 500 people. Before tonight, I believe she was still deciding." Grant sat back down in his chair. Clara left him there. He sat for a long time. The gala moved around him. The live auction began. The music shifted. Servers cleared early courses and replaced them with desserts he didn't look at. People moved past his table with the particular trajectory of people who have decided not to see someone, which is different from people who haven't noticed them. They had noticed him. They simply weren't stopping. In a room full of people who understood power and money and the architecture of influence word had moved with the speed that information moves at events like this, one person to person, quiet phrase by quiet phrase, until the entire room had assembled a version of the evening's events that was close enough to accurate to matter. Grant Holloway had humiliated his wife publicly. His wife was Rebecca Whitmore. His company was under financial investigation. And he was sitting alone at a table near the west wall, while his wife stood in the center of the room looking like she had never once needed him. Across the ballroom, Madeline Cross was collecting her wrap from the coat check attendant. She was leaving. Grant watched her go. I thought about all the things he had said to her over the past 18 months, the things he had promised, The version of their future he had described a new beginning, a clean start. Everything rebuilt properly now that he was finally going to stop pretending. He had told her the marriage to Rebecca was long dead. He had told her Rebecca was comfortable and unchallenging, and that they had made each other smaller over the years. He had told her these things, and he had believed them. He had believed them because they were easier than the alternative being that Rebecca had never been small, she had simply been quiet. And he had mistaken her quiet for smallness because he needed her to be small, because the version of himself that Grant Holloway had built over 25 years of ambition and acquisition, and the performance of success required at its foundation, the belief that he had gotten somewhere the people around him could not have gotten without him. Rebecca had never competed with him. He had read her lack of competition as lack of ability. He looked at her now across the ballroom where she was standing with a small group of foundation board members and speaking with the ease of someone who has spent her whole life in rooms like this one because she had, even if she had hidden it from him, even if the years of hiding it had made him forget that she had a whole life before he decided she was his. He stood up. He crossed the room one final time. The people nearby noticed. Nobody moved to stop him. Nobody warned Rebecca. They simply watched. Rebecca saw him coming from 15 feet away. She excused herself from the conversation with the quiet ease of someone who is in control of her own time, and she moved 3 steps to the side, so they were standing in a slight remove from the nearest group. "Rebecca," Grant said. And he heard his own voice finally, without the bourbon or the adrenaline or the performance layered over it. And what he heard was simply a man who had made a catastrophic mistake and knew it. "I need you to know that I am sorry." She waited. "I don't mean sorry because of your family," he said. "I mean sorry because of what I said, on that stage, in front of people." "All right," she said, "and because I removed you from the guest list." "Yes, and because of Madeline." He paused. "I know that's the least surprising thing I've said tonight, but I need to say it." Rebecca looked at him, not with anger, not with grief, or not only with grief, with something that was very close to sadness and very close to acceptance and very far from forgiveness, not because forgiveness was impossible, but because forgiveness was not the same thing as reconciliation, and she understood the difference. "Grant," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, just this once, just right now." "Okay," he said. "If Alexander had never walked through those doors tonight—" She stopped, held the question for a moment. "If my family had never come, if I were standing here exactly as you believed I was, just your wife, just Rebecca, nothing behind me, nothing in front of me, would you still want me back?" Grant opened his mouth. He closed it. He thought about the question. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life knowing what to say. He had negotiated contracts and city council approvals and press interviews and board disagreements and the specific social choreography of Chicago's business class. He always had words. He had nothing. And his nothing was the most honest thing he had given her in years. Rebecca watched his silence for 5 seconds. Then she reached down to her left hand. She removed her wedding ring. She set it on the nearest table, not thrown, not dramatic, simply placed with the same quiet precision she applied to everything that mattered. "Then you don't miss your wife," she said. "You miss what you just found out she was worth." She looked at him one last time, not with hatred, not with triumph, with something so much more devastating than either of those, with the simple clarity of a woman who finally understands that the love she gave was real, that the years were real, and that none of that changes the truth of what he had just shown her. "Take care of yourself, Grant," she said, and she turned around. And she walked back toward her mother and her brother and the life she had set aside for 6 years, and she did not look back, not once, not even when she heard him say her name one more time into the air behind her. The ring stayed on the table. A server found it 20 minutes later and turned it into the coat check. Grant retrieved it at the end of the evening. He drove home alone. And in the morning, when Chicago's business pages ran the first pieces about the unexpected appearance of Rebecca Whitmore at the Lakefront Hope Foundation Gala, and about what her return to Whitmore Holdings might mean for the city's major infrastructure financing, Grant Holloway sat at his kitchen table with his coffee going cold and read about his wife. Not about Holloway Urban Development, not about himself, about her. And for the first time in 6 years, Grant Holloway understood that he had never actually known the person he had married. He had known only the version of her that she had allowed him to see, and she had allowed him to see all of her that mattered. He simply hadn't been paying attention. The morning after the gala, Chicago woke up to something it hadn't expected. Not a scandal, not a crisis, something more unsettling than either of those, at least for the people whose names appeared in it. A story. The first piece ran at 6:47 in the morning on the Tribune's Business Digital Edition. The headline was clean and precise and devastating in the way that only true things can be devastating. Rebecca Whitmore returns billionaire heiress resurfaces at charity gala after 6 years, resumes executive role at Whitmore Holdings. By 7:15, it had been picked up by 4 other outlets. By 8 o'clock, it was on the radar of every major financial desk in the city. By 9, the phones inside Holloway Urban Development's Michigan Avenue offices were ringing with the specific frequency of calls that nobody wants to receive on a Wednesday morning. Grant Holloway didn't go into the office. He sat at the kitchen table of the house he and Rebecca had shared for 5 years, the house she had decorated without making it feel decorated, the house where she had made coffee every morning without being asked, and left it on the counter for him without pointing out that she had done it, and he read every word of every article on his laptop with the methodical focus of a man trying to understand how a building he thought he owned had turned out to belong to someone else entirely. The articles were not unkind to Rebecca. They were, if anything, slightly awestruck, the particular tone that journalists use when they've stumbled onto a human story that exceeds the financial story they were sent to cover. Sources close to the Whitmore family confirm that Rebecca Whitmore voluntarily stepped back from an active executive role 6 years ago to pursue a private life. Her return to Whitmore Holdings was announced Tuesday evening at the Lakefront Hope Foundation Gala, where she was accompanied by her brother Alexander Whitmore and her mother Margaret Whitmore, who made a rare public appearance. One piece from a lifestyle journalist who had been at the gala added a detail that made Grant set his coffee cup down. Those present described the reunion as emotional. Mrs. Whitmore, who attended the event as the wife of developer Grant Holloway before her identity became known, received a standing ovation from the assembled guests. As the wife of Grant Holloway, before her identity became known. He read that sentence 3 times. He understood reading it that this was how the story would be told from now on. Not as the story of Grant Holloway's success, as the story of the woman who had walked away from more than Grant would ever build to love a man who turned out not to deserve it. His phone rang at 9:20. His attorney, James Ferris, who had been handling Holloway Urban Development's legal affairs for 11 years and who had a voice that was always professionally calm, regardless of the content it was delivering. James Ferris, who today sounded like a man who had been awake since 5 in the morning. "Grant, I need you in my office today. Not tomorrow, today." "I know about the investigation," Grant said. A short pause. "Then you know more than I did until 40 minutes ago. Start talking." Grant told him what Clara Mendez had told him the night before, about the forensic team, about the financial irregularities, about the expense reports and the property in River North, and the transactions that didn't match the corporate filings. He said it plainly, the way a man says things when he has run out of the energy required to present them better than they are. James listened without interrupting. When Grant finished, James said, "The River North property, is it in your name or the company's name?" "The company's," Grant said. "But it was used personally." "Yes." Another pause, longer. "And Ms. Cross was aware of the arrangement. She was the primary occupant." "Grant," James's voice dropped the last of its professional neutrality. "Tell me you have documentation that this was disclosed to your board." Grant said nothing. "Tell me," James said very quietly, "that this appears somewhere in your board minutes." James. "Grant, it doesn't appear in the board minutes." The silence on the line lasted long enough that Grant checked to make sure the call was still connected. "All right," James said finally. "Don't talk to anyone. Don't respond to press. Don't contact Rebecca or anyone in the Whitmore organization. I'll have my office set up a meeting for 2 o'clock. Be there." He hung up. Grant set the phone on the kitchen counter and looked at the coffee Rebecca had not made this morning, because Rebecca was not in this house, because Rebecca had not come home last night, because Rebecca had taken nothing except the small overnight bag she kept in the hallway closet for travel, a habit from a previous life he now understood, from a version of herself that had always been prepared to move, and she had left while Grant was still driving home from the gala. She had been that certain. She had not needed a night to think about it. She had already thought about it. For 2 months or more. while Grant was planning a future with Madeline and managing the Riverfront South pre-construction timeline and accepting humanitarian leadership awards. Rebecca had been thinking very clearly about what she was going to do. She had simply been waiting for the moment that made the decision undeniable. He had given her that moment on a stage with a microphone. Meanwhile, across the city in the guest suite of the Whitmore family's Gold Coast residence, a house that Grant had never been invited to, had not known existed in a family, he had not known his wife belonged to Rebecca, was eating breakfast with her mother. It was the first breakfast they had eaten together in over a year. Margaret Whitmore was not a woman who performed warmth. She expressed it through specifics, through remembering that Rebecca took her coffee with no sugar, but a small amount of cream, through having that ready, without mentioning it, through having the newspaper folded to the arts section rather than the business section, because she knew Rebecca would get to the business section on her own and didn't need it waiting for her like a demand. Rebecca sat across from her mother and drank her coffee and felt for the first time in longer than she could accurately calculate like she was in the right room. "You slept," Margaret said. It was an observation, not a question. "Better than I expected," Rebecca said. "The body knows things before the mind admits them." Margaret set her cup down. "You've been tired for a long time. I could hear it in your voice on the phone, even when you were telling me everything was fine." "I was trying to believe it." "I know." A pause. "I never said I told you so, Rebecca. I want you to know that I'm not going to start." Rebecca looked at her mother. "You thought he wasn't right for me from the beginning." "I thought he loved you for the wrong reasons," Margaret said carefully. "But I have been wrong about people before, and you were happy in the early years, and your happiness was worth more to me than my being right." "He did love me," Rebecca said. "In the beginning. That part was real. I believe you. I just need you to believe that I wasn't wrong about everything." Margaret Whitmore reached across the table and put her hand over her daughter's hand, and she didn't say anything for a moment, because some things don't require words to be fully communicated between a mother and a daughter who know each other the way they knew each other. "You were not wrong about everything," Margaret said. "You were wrong about one thing, and the thing you were wrong about wasn't loving him. The thing you were wrong about was believing that making yourself smaller would make his love larger." Rebecca was quiet. "Love doesn't expand to fill a vacuum," Margaret continued. "When you make yourself smaller, people don't love the space you leave. They simply stop seeing you in it." Rebecca held that. Then she said, "I saw the articles this morning." "So did Alexander. He's been on calls since 6, about the Riverfront South situation. Among other things." Margaret picked up her coffee again. "Your brother is managing the business elements. That's his role, and he's very good at it. What I want to know about is you, not the business. You." Rebecca looked at her mother. "I'm angry," she said, and the word came out with more texture than she expected, more layers. Not the hot surface anger of the night before, but something slower and deeper, the kind of anger that has been compressed under patience for a long time and is only now finding room to breathe. "I'm angry that I spent 6 years watching myself disappear and calling it love. I'm angry that I knew something was wrong for almost a year and kept finding reasons to explain it away. I'm angry that the night it finally ended, I was standing outside the ballroom because he had taken my name off the guest list and put hers on instead." She stopped. "I'm angry at myself most of all, because I knew who I was. I didn't forget. I chose to set it down. And then I forgot that setting something down temporarily is different from letting someone take it from you." Margaret listened to all of this without interrupting. "That anger," she said when Rebecca finished, "is the healthiest thing I've heard from you in 6 years. Rebecca almost laughed. "Don't waste it on him," Margaret said. "Use it for something." At 11 o'clock that morning, Alexander knocked on the guest suite door and came in with his tablet and the specific expression of a man who has prepared an update and intends to deliver it efficiently. "How are you?" he asked Rebecca. "Functional," she said. "Tell me what you know." He sat down across from her and pulled up a document on the tablet. "The forensic review that our team completed over the past 7 weeks identified 4 categories of concern in Holloway Urban Development's financial records. Undisclosed personal expenses charged to company accounts. We're looking at approximately $230,000 over 18 months. A lease agreement on a River North property structured as a corporate asset but used exclusively as a personal residence, which constitutes an undisclosed benefit to a senior employee, specifically Madeline Cross. Several transfers between the company's discretionary capital fund and what appears to be a personal investment account that Grant controls privately. And expense reports submitted for board review that don't match the underlying receipts. Rebecca listened carefully. What's the exposure? Regulatory at minimum, the city's Commercial Development Oversight Board will likely initiate a review once our referral is filed. Securities implications are possible depending on how the investment transfers are categorized. His personal liability depends on what his board knew and when. Alexander set the tablet down. Rebecca, I want to be clear about something. The referral we're filing is based entirely on the evidence our team found. This isn't retaliation for last night. The timeline exists independently of the gala. I know that, she said. I was the one who called you 2 months ago. I know. I'm saying it for my own clarity as much as yours. He paused. How do you want to handle the Riverfront South financing question? We have 18 days before the coalition vote. We can proceed with the existing structure and let the oversight process play out separately. We can accelerate the review and let the vote follow the findings. Or we can withdraw from the coalition entirely, which sends its own message. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. What does the project actually need? She said. Not what does Grant's company need. What does the project need? Alexander looked at her. The community study suggested that the current development plan prioritizes commercial square footage over affordable housing by about 60-40. The city's stated priority for that corridor is the reverse. So the project plan doesn't actually match the city's needs. Grant's version of it doesn't. Then the coalition should restructure the partnership requirements before the vote, Rebecca said. Not to remove Grant's company, to require alignment with what the city actually asked for. If Holloway Urban Development can meet those requirements, they stay in. If they can't or won't, the coalition finds a partner who will. Alexander studied her. That's not a punishment, he said. It's not supposed to be, Rebecca said. The project serves 40,000 residents of that corridor. It's not a mechanism for managing my divorce. Something shifted in Alexander's expression. Not surprise exactly, but the particular look of someone who has been waiting to see whether a person they love has become who they always believed they could be. All right, he said. I'll have the coalition framework revised. And Alex. She waited until he looked at her directly. I want to be the one who presents the revised framework. Not legal, not you, me. The coalition board meets Thursday. I know. Give me Wednesday to prepare. He nodded once. Then he said, Welcome back, Rebecca. She held his gaze for a moment. I'm not back, she said. I'm starting. 2 days later, in a conference room on the 34th floor of a building that overlooked the same stretch of lakefront where the gala had taken place 72 hours earlier, Rebecca Whitmore walked into a room of 14 people she had never met, sat at the head of the table her brother had arranged for her, and presented a revised framework for the Riverfront South Financing Coalition that nobody in that room had been expecting. She had spent Tuesday preparing it, and most of Tuesday night reviewing it, and Wednesday morning revising it again, and she had done it alone without Alexander's team because she needed to know that the thinking was hers. The room included 3 City of Fixture Investment Commission, 4 coalition board members, 2 independent financial advisors, and 2 attorneys. They had all read the one-page summary Alexander's office had distributed that morning. They were all professionally courteous and quietly skeptical in the specific way that rooms full of experienced people are skeptical of someone they haven't yet had the chance to evaluate. Rebecca had been in rooms like this before long ago, and she had learned something in those rooms that she hadn't fully appreciated until she spent 6 years being invisible. The people who speak last in rooms like this are usually the ones who have been most carefully listening. She let them speak first. The city official, a woman named Patricia Chen, who ran the Municipal Development Oversight Division with the reputation of someone who did not respond well to being managed, opened by saying, Ms. Whitmore, I want to be direct with you about our position. The Riverfront South project has been in planning for 3 years. Restructuring the partnership framework 18 days before the coalition vote creates significant timeline risk. I'd like to understand why you believe that risk is worth taking. Because the current framework produces the wrong project, Rebecca said. Patricia Chen looked at her. The community impact study from 14 months ago showed that 63% of existing residents in the Riverfront South corridor are cost-burdened renters. Rebecca continued. The current development plan adds 420 units of market-rate housing and 280 units designated affordable. That's 60-40 in the wrong direction. What the city asked for in the original RFP was community-anchored development. What we're currently voting on is a commercial real estate project with an affordable housing attachment. A silence in the room. One of the coalition board members, older man real estate background, the kind of person who has heard many presentations and retained very few of them, said, "The current plan meets all regulatory thresholds." "Meeting thresholds and fulfilling intent are different things," Rebecca said. "I'm not here to argue that the current plan is illegal. I'm here to suggest that we have 18 days to make it better." "Better according to whom?" the board member said. "According to the 40,000 people who live in that corridor," Rebecca said. "I reviewed the public comment submissions from the original RFP process. 216 individual community members submitted comments. I read all of them. The word they used most often was not affordable. It was stability. They want to stay in their neighborhood. They want to know that development benefits them rather than displaces them." She paused. "I'm proposing that we revise the unit ratio to 55% affordable, add a workforce development component with a funded apprenticeship program for local residents, and require that all subcontracting within the first 18 months prioritize businesses headquartered in the affected zip codes." Patricia Chen had been writing something while Rebecca spoke. She looked up. "Those additions will affect the commercial return profile," she said. "By approximately 8% in year 1, Rebecca agreed. "By year 3, the community investment components create enough stabilization in the corridor that property values increase at a rate that recovers that differential. I have the modeling if you'd like to review it." She slid a folder across the table to Patricia Chen. Patricia Chen opened it. She read for 90 seconds. Then she looked at Rebecca with an expression that had shifted from skeptical to something more genuinely attentive. "Who built this model?" she asked. "I did," Rebecca said. Another silence. Shorter this time. "All right," Patricia Chen said. "Let's talk about the subcontracting requirements." The meeting ran 2 hours and 17 minutes. Rebecca stayed for all of it. She answered every question directly. She acknowledged the gaps in her framework. Honestly, she wrote down 3 specific concerns raised by the financial advisors and told them she would have revised numbers by Friday morning. She did not perform confidence she didn't have. She also didn't apologize for the confidence she did have. When the room emptied, Patricia Chen paused at the door. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, "I've been in coalition review meetings for 11 years. People don't usually come into this room with a revised framework and a community comment analysis and an 8% return modeling adjustment in 72 hours. "I had good materials to work from," Rebecca said. "That's not what I'm commenting on," Patricia Chen said. "I'm commenting on the fact that you read 216 public comments." Rebecca met her eyes. "Those are the people the project is for," she said simply. Patricia Chen nodded once and left. Rebecca sat alone in the conference room for a moment. She thought about something Margaret had said 2 mornings ago. Power looks very different from below. She had known that academically before Grant. She had heard it in board meetings and read it in strategy documents and understood it as a principle. But she hadn't known it the way she knew it now, not as a concept, but as a lived experience, the specific and irreplaceable knowledge that comes from spending years in a position where your voice is not the loudest in the room and your name is not the one on the program. She had spent 6 years being underestimated. She was going to spend the next 6 years being useful. 4 days after the coalition meeting on a Monday morning, Madeline Cross submitted her resignation from Holloway Urban Development. The resignation letter was 3 sentences long and cited personal reasons, which was the specific phrase people use when the real reasons are both obvious and legally inadvisable to document. Grant accepted it by email. He had been at his attorney's office every day since Wednesday, and the picture being assembled from the forensic team's findings was becoming clearer and more expensive with each session. James Ferris had stopped using the word irregularities and started using the word exposure, which was a meaningful shift in vocabulary. The Riverfront South Coalition voted on restructured partnership requirements the following Thursday. Holloway Urban Development was given 60 days to submit a revised project plan aligned with the new framework. The coalition statement noted that the revised framework better served the project's original community mandate. Grant read the statement in James Ferris's conference room. He read the part about the community mandate. He knew whose language that was. He set the paper down and said to no one in particular, she revised the whole framework in 72 hours. James Ferris, reviewing a separate document across the table, said, apparently. She presented to the full coalition board. She did. And Patricia Chen, who hasn't agreed with the developer's proposal without 6 months of negotiation in the last decade, signed off on the revised model in 4 days. Grant, James said, with the patience of a man who has been billing $300 an hour to listen to this and is beginning to feel that his time could be better spent. What exactly are you processing right now? Grant was quiet for a moment. I spent 6 years thinking she needed me, he said. James set his document down and looked at his client with genuine, undisguised human directness for the first time in 11 years of professional relationship. Grant, he said, I need you to focus, because the Oversight Board has a preliminary review scheduled for 3 weeks from today, and your personal liability in this situation is very real, and the most important thing you can do for yourself right now is not read press releases about your wife. Ex-wife, Grant said. Not legally yet, James said, which is another conversation we need to have today. I know. Grant picked the paper back up. He looked at the coalition statement. He looked at the phrase community mandate and the revised percentage breakdowns and the workforce development component that hadn't existed in any version of the project he had built. She read the public comments, he said quietly, 216 of them, from residents. James looked at him without expression. I've been working in city development for 20 years, Grant said. I have never once read the public comment submissions. James Ferris, who had also never read public comment submissions in the course of any professional engagement he had undertaken, picked his document back up and said nothing. The Oversight Board's preliminary review was scheduled and postponed once at Grant's attorney's request, and then rescheduled. The financial questions surrounding Holloway urban development became a consistent presence in the business press, not as a full scandal, not yet, but as the specific kind of ongoing story that makes investors nervous and board members request special meetings, and longtime business associates suddenly find that their calendars are very full. Grant resigned as CEO of Holloway Urban Development 6 weeks after the gala. The announcement was handled by the company's communications department, which no longer had Madeline Cross running it. The statement was 3 paragraphs long and said that Grant was stepping back to focus on personal matters while the company conducted an internal review. It was the kind of statement that says everything by what it doesn't say. Rebecca read it the morning it was released. She was in her office at Whitmore Holdings by then, a proper office, not a temporary arrangement with her name on the building directory and her calendar scheduled 3 weeks out and a team of 8 who were still deciding how much to trust her, but who had in the first weeks shown her the specific professional respect of people who had heard what she did with the Riverfront South framework and were waiting to see what she would do next. She read Grant's resignation statement once. She didn't forward it to anyone. She didn't save it. She closed the tab and opened her calendar for the day, which had a community stakeholder meeting at 10, a budget review at 1, and at 3 o'clock a call with a nonprofit developer in the South Side who was interested in partnering on an affordable housing project that Rebecca had been quietly building a proposal for since her second week back. She had 12 things to do that day. Grant's resignation was not one of them. Her assistant knocked on the open office door at 8:50. The community meeting is in the large conference room. You have 7 minutes. Thank you, Diane, Rebecca said. She picked up her folder. She thought briefly, not guiltily, not sentimentally, but honestly about the man she had married, about the good years which had been real, about the version of him that had asked her what she actually believed about things and had seemed to genuinely want to know. About the way love can be simultaneously real and insufficient, true and misdirected, genuine, and not enough to overcome the damage done by a person who mistakes patience for powerlessness. She thought about that for approximately 4 seconds. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked out of her office toward the conference room where 14 community stakeholders were waiting to tell her what they needed. She was listening. She had always been listening. The difference now was that she had stopped pretending she couldn't act on what she heard. 6 weeks after the gala, Grant Holloway's name appeared in the Chicago Tribune for the second time in a month. The first time it had appeared in the context of Rebecca's return to Whitmore Holdings. This time it appeared in the context of a regulatory inquiry filed by the city's Commercial Development Oversight Board following a referral from an unnamed institutional investor. Nobody needed to name the investor. The article was careful and precise and thoroughly sourced, and it said what it said without saying more than it needed to. Grant Holloway, founder and former CEO of Holloway Urban Development, was the subject of a preliminary inquiry into financial management practices at his company. The inquiry focused on the use of corporate funds for personal expenditures, potential conflicts of interest in contractor relationships, and discrepancies between expense reports submitted for board review and underlying financial records. Grant's attorney had reviewed the article before publication and had provided a statement that used the phrases cooperating fully and confident in the outcome and committed to transparency, which were the specific phrases that attorneys provide when their clients are in genuine trouble and need to appear not to be. Rebecca read the article at her desk at 7 in the morning. She read it once carefully, and then she set her phone face down on her desk and sat for a moment with the particular stillness of someone processing something that is both expected and still difficult. She had known this was coming. She had initiated the chain of events that led here 2 months before the Gala, when she had recognized something wrong in a stack of papers she was sorting for a man who had stopped seeing her clearly enough to be careful around her. She had made that call to Alexander with full knowledge of what she was putting in motion. She had not made it out of anger. She had made it because she had looked at the numbers and understood that what she was seeing was real, and that the right thing to do with something real is not to pretend it away. But understanding a consequence intellectually and feeling it land are different experiences, and Rebecca was honest enough with herself to sit with that difference for the 4 minutes she allowed herself before she opened her calendar and started her day. She had not destroyed Grant Holloway. She had simply stopped protecting him from what he had already done. That distinction mattered to her. It mattered enough that she had said it out loud to Alexander the week before, when he had come to her office with an update on the regulatory process, and had asked carefully whether she wanted to be kept informed of developments. "Keep me informed of what directly affects Whitmore's position," she had told him. "Not the rest." Alexander had studied her. "You don't want updates on Grant specifically." "I want to know what I need to know to make good decisions about the business," she said. "His personal consequences are not my business anymore. They stopped being my business when he told 500 people that his marriage was dead weight." Alexander had nodded, but he had looked at her with the expression of someone who wanted to ask one more thing and was deciding whether to. "Ask," Rebecca said. "Are you doing this well?" he said, "or are you doing a very good impression of doing well?" She had thought about that honestly. "Both," she said. "Some days both." He had nodded again, and that had been enough, because Alexander Whitmore was not a man who needed more from people than what they were willing to give honestly. The morning of the Tribune article, her assistant Diane knocked at 8:15 with coffee and the day's briefing sheet, and she set both on the desk with the careful neutrality of someone who had also read the article and was waiting to take her cue from the woman across from her. "Thank you, Diane," Rebecca said. "The Southside meeting is confirmed for 10, Diane said. "And you have a call request from someone at the foundation, a board member named Carol Whitfield. She says it's personal rather than professional." Rebecca didn't recognize the name immediately. "What does she want?" She didn't say specifically. She mentioned that she was at the Lakefront Gala and wanted to reach out. Rebecca thought for a moment. "Set it up for 4 o'clock, 15 minutes. "Of course." Diane paused at the door. "The Tribune piece." "I saw it," Rebecca said. "Do you need anything?" Rebecca looked at her assistant, a woman in her late 40s who had worked for Whitmore Holdings for 12 years and who had the specific competence of someone who has seen a great deal and learned to respond to all of it with useful action rather than excessive comment. "I'm fine," Rebecca said. "Let's have a good day." And they did. The Southside meeting at 10 was with a nonprofit developer named Marcus Webb, who had been working for 7 years to finance a mixed-use affordable housing project in a corridor that every major developer had passed on because the financial returns didn't pencil out at market rate. Marcus Webb was 44, direct and deeply skeptical of large family trusts and their community investment initiatives, which he communicated clearly in the first 8 minutes of the meeting. "I've heard the Whitmore name in connection with 3 different projects in this city over the past decade," he said. "In 2 of them, the community investment framing was real. In one of them, it was marketing. I'd like to know which category this conversation falls into before I spend more of my organization's time on it. Rebecca looked at him across the conference table. That's a fair question, she said, and I don't think I can answer it by telling you. I think I can answer it by showing you the Riverfront South framework we revised last month and letting you judge the priorities we built into it. She slid the document across the table. Marcus Webb read it. He read it the way a person reads something. They are determined not to be impressed by, and are becoming impressed by, despite themselves slowly, with occasional pauses, with the slight tension around the jaw of someone revising an assumption they had been comfortable with. The workforce apprenticeship component, he said. Who funds that? Whitmore Community Investment Initiative covers 60% in year 1, Rebecca said. The City Workforce Development Board has committed to the remaining 40% pending final project approval. You got the City Workforce Board to commit. Patricia Chen introduced me to their director, Rebecca said. They were looking for a project to anchor a new apprenticeship model. We gave them one. Marcus Webb set the document down. Patricia Chen introduced you. Yes. He looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. Patricia Chen's endorsement in the world of Chicago community development was worth more than most financial commitments. She did not introduce people to city department directors unless she had reason to believe those introductions would be used well. The South Side project has a different challenge, Marcus said. It's not the unit ratio. We've already committed to 70% affordable. The challenge is construction financing. We have the land. We have the community support. We have 12 years of relationship equity in that neighborhood. We don't have the capital to break ground. How much? Rebecca said. $18 million for Phase 1. What does Phase 1 deliver? 240 units, a community health clinic on the ground floor, and a small business incubator with 12 commercial spaces reserved for neighborhood entrepreneurs at below-market lease rates. Rebecca wrote something on the notepad in front of her. Give me 3 weeks, she said. Marcus Webb looked at her steadily. To do what? To structure a financing proposal, she said. Not a pledge, a working proposal with a capital commitment attached. If you don't like what I come back with, you walk away, and we never had this conversation. A silence. Why this project? Marcus said. There are other affordable housing initiatives in this city that are more financially straightforward. Why does Whitmore want the hard one? Rebecca set her pen down. Because easy projects don't change anything, she said. They improve things marginally. They hit regulatory targets. They look good in annual reports. The hard projects, the ones nobody else will touch, because the returns require patience instead of speed. Those are the ones that actually shift what a neighborhood becomes in 10 years. She looked at him directly. I spent 6 years away from this work. I learned some things during those years that I couldn't have learned here. One of them is that the people who most need what we're talking about are also the people most practiced at being promised things that don't materialize. I'm not here to make a promise. I'm here to build something real. Marcus Webb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Rebecca confirmed. He stood, shook her hand, and left. Rebecca sat alone in the conference room for 90 seconds after he walked out, which was approximately how long it took her to feel the weight of what she had just committed to, and then decide that the weight was appropriate and she would carry it. Then she went back to her office and started working. At 4 o'clock, the call with Carol Whitfield came through. Carol Whitfield turned out to be a 63-year-old philanthropist who had been on the Lakefront Hope Foundation board for 9 years and who had been sitting 8 feet from Rebecca when Grant made his speech. She told Rebecca directly, also been close enough to hear what Madeline Cross had said afterward. I want to say something to you, Carol said. And I want to say it clearly, because I think it needs to be said clearly, rather than politely. All right, Rebecca said. What happened to you that evening was cruel, Carol said. Not unfortunate, not a misunderstanding, cruel. And the fact that you walked out of that ballroom with your head level and made one phone call and changed the entire architecture of the evening, I've been thinking about that for 6 weeks, and I needed to tell you that it mattered, not just to me, to a lot of people in that room. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said. That means something. I also wanted to ask, Carol continued, whether you'd be willing to have lunch, not for any professional reason, because I think you're someone worth knowing, and I'm at an age where I've stopped waiting to tell people that. Rebecca found herself smiling. I'd like that. Thursday, Carol said. I know a place that does excellent soup and doesn't require us to be seen. Thursday works, Rebecca said. She hung up and sat with the unexpected lightness of that conversation for a moment, the specific warmth of being seen clearly by a stranger and having it feel like recognition rather than intrusion. She had forgotten what that felt like. She was remembering. 3 weeks later, Rebecca returned to Marcus Webb's office with an $18 million financing proposal, structured across 4 capital sources: Whitmore Community Investment Initiative, leading at 40% a community development financial institution, at 25%, a philanthropic foundation grant, at 20%, and a city infrastructure bond allocation, at 15%. The proposal included a 10-year community benefit agreement, a local hire requirement covering 60% of construction jobs, and a review mechanism that gave neighborhood residents a formal voice in project decisions above a defined budget threshold. Marcus Webb read it for 22 minutes without speaking. His project manager, a woman named Sonia, who had been with his organization for 8 years and who had reviewed dozens of financing proposals from institutional partners, was sitting beside him, and she read it at the same pace, and when they both finished, they looked at each other with the particular look of 2 people who have just had the same thought simultaneously and are checking to make sure they're not wrong about it. The Community Benefit Agreement, Marcus said. The review mechanism for decisions above the threshold. That's unusual. It's based on a model used in Portland and Minneapolis, Rebecca said. I modified it for Chicago's regulatory structure. You modified it yourself? Yes, in 3 weeks. I had a good team and I didn't sleep much, she said, which was true. She had worked 12-hour days for most of those 3 weeks, fueled by the specific energy that comes when you are finally doing work that matches the full capacity of what you're capable of. It was exhausting, and it was exactly right, and she wouldn't have traded it. The local hire requirement, Sonia said, 60% is higher than anything I've seen from an institutional partner at this scale. It's achievable if the workforce apprenticeship component from Riverfront South feeds into it, Rebecca said. We're building a pipeline, not just a project. The apprentices from Riverfront South can be hired for Phase 1 construction here 18 months from now. That's the actual idea, not one project at a time, but a system that connects them. Marcus Webb set the proposal down. He looked at Rebecca Whitmore, this woman who 6 weeks ago had been identified publicly as the wife of a disgraced developer who 3 weeks ago had asked him to give her time to build something real, who was sitting across from him now with an $18 million financing proposal and a 10-year community benefit agreement and a workforce pipeline concept that connected 2 projects across 2 neighborhoods on the south and west sides of Chicago. When can you break ground? He said. Rebecca allowed herself 1 full second of private satisfaction. That depends on how quickly you can get your board to approve the partnership agreement, she said. 2 weeks, Marcus said. Then 10 months, she said. We can break ground in 10 months. He extended his hand. She shook it. And the South Side project became real. The news reached Alexander that afternoon through the standard internal briefing process, and he read the summary and put it in his desk drawer and called his mother. She structured the whole financing in 3 weeks, he said. 18 million 4 sources community benefit agreement, local hire requirement. She did the Portland-Minneapolis model research herself. Margaret was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. She always could, Margaret said. I know. The question was never whether she could. The question was whether she remembered that she could. She remembers, Alexander said. Another silence. Good, Margaret said simply, and the word carried everything she didn't need to say out loud. Meanwhile, in the offices of James Ferris on LaSalle Street, the regulatory picture for Grant Holloway was becoming significantly less abstract. The preliminary inquiry had progressed to a formal review. The Oversight Board had requested 4 years of financial records. Grant's personal accountant had hired his own attorney, which was the specific move that attorneys make when they believe their exposure is different from their client's exposure, and they want to be certain the separation is documented. 2 of Grant's longtime board members had requested independent legal representation for their interactions with the oversight process. The company was surviving. Under new leadership, an interim CEO named David Park, who had been COO for 3 years and who moved through the organization's crisis with the steady efficiency of someone who had always suspected certain decisions would eventually require managing Holloway urban development, was stabilizing. The Riverfront South revised plan had been submitted with the new community framework requirements, and while the project's commercial profile was different from what Grant had designed, it was proceeding. Grant himself was not. He had moved out of the house. Rebecca's attorneys had made that straightforward, and he hadn't contested it, because contesting it would have required an argument about who the house belonged to, and Grant was no longer in a position to have that argument confidently. He was living in a furnished apartment in River North, which was either ironic or simply practical, depending on how you looked at it. Madeline Cross had left Chicago. She had taken a communications position in New York with a media company, announced quietly on her professional profile, with no mention of Chicago or Holloway urban development or the evening at the Lakefront Hope Foundation Gala. She had sent Grant one text message 3 days after her resignation. "I think we both know this was always going to end this way. I'm sorry it ended this badly." He had not responded. He had read it 4 times. On a Thursday evening, 8 weeks after the gala, Grant sat in his furnished apartment with a glass of water he wasn't drinking and a television he wasn't watching, and he did something he hadn't done since he was a much younger man with much less to manage and much more uncertainty to sit with. He thought honestly about himself, not defensively, not with the internal litigation that had characterized most of his self-examination in the past 2 months, the constant search for mitigating factors, the rehearsal of alternative narratives, the accounting of what he had given and what he had built, and why those things deserved to be weighed against the things he had done wrong. He put all of that down deliberately, the way Rebecca had put her wedding ring down on the table at the gala, not with drama, just with the quiet finality of someone who is finished carrying something. He thought about the man he had been when Rebecca fell in love with him. He had been genuinely curious then, about ideas, about people, about what things were made of underneath their surfaces. He had asked Rebecca what she actually believed about things because he had actually wanted to know. He had been building something in those early years with the excitement of someone who doesn't yet know how much of what they're building is genuine and how much is performance, who is still in the period before success teaches you to confuse the two. He tried to identify exactly when the confusion had started. He couldn't find a single moment. That was the honest answer. It hadn't been a decision. It had been a drift, slow and incremental, and in the direction of his ego's preference year by year, until the man who had asked Rebecca what she believed had become a man who stopped asking because he had decided that what she believed wasn't relevant to what he was building. He had made himself the center of a story he was only partially the author of. Rebecca had been writing her own story the entire time. He simply hadn't been paying attention to it. His phone rang. James Ferris. He answered. "The Oversight Board has completed its preliminary review," James said. "They're moving to a formal enforcement proceeding. The personal liability question is more serious than we initially assessed. I need you in my office tomorrow at 8. "How serious?" Grant said. "Civil, most likely, rather than criminal. But the financial penalties could be significant. And there's a board member who has indicated he intends to pursue personal liability claims against you independent of the regulatory process." Grant absorbed this. "James," he said, "what does cooperation look like, full cooperation? Not strategic cooperation, full." A pause. "Why?" "Because I'm tired of the strategy," Grant said. "I'm tired of managing the story. Tell me what full cooperation produces and what it costs." James was quiet for a moment. "It likely produces a faster resolution with reduced penalties. It costs you the narrative control you've been trying to maintain." "I've already lost the narrative," Grant said. "I lost it the night I picked up that microphone." He paused. "Tell the Oversight Board we'll cooperate fully. Complete document access. No attorney objections to the production timeline. And tell them I want to meet with the board directly without intermediaries." Another silence. "Grant," James said carefully, "that's a significant change in posture." "I know. Are you sure?" "I made a lot of decisions in the past 6 years because they were strategically correct," Grant said. "I need to make at least one because it's right. Schedule the meeting." James hung up. Grant set the phone down. He looked at the glass of water on the table in front of him. "I thought about Rebecca in that ballroom, watching him accept an award for humanitarian leadership while she stood 30 feet away without a name on the guest list." He thought about her face in the moment when he told her the marriage was finished, not devastated, not angry, simply clear with the specific clarity of a person who has received information they had already prepared for. He thought about the ring she had placed on the table and the question she had asked before placing it. If Alexander had never walked through those doors tonight, would you still want me back? He had not been able to answer. He understood now what that silence had actually been. Not confusion, not being caught off guard. He had not answered because some part of him, the part that had not yet finished being honest with himself, had recognized the truth before he was willing to say it. No. If Alexander Whitmore had not walked through those doors, Grant would not have wanted Rebecca back. He had told himself the marriage was finished for a long time before that evening. He had been building a different future, with a different woman and a different narrative about why the marriage had failed, a narrative in which Rebecca's quietness was smallness, and her patience was passivity, and her refusal to compete with him was evidence that she had nothing to compete with. He had needed that narrative, because the alternative that Rebecca was extraordinary, that she had voluntarily set aside an extraordinary life to love him plainly, that he had responded to that gift by making her invisible. The alternative was a story about himself that Grant Holloway had not been ready to be the man in. He was ready now, not because it was comfortable, because there was nothing left to gain from avoiding it. The Oversight Board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Grant went in without a prepared statement, and without the specific armor of a man who believes his job is to manage the perception of others. He sat across from 4 board members and answered every question directly, and when he didn't know an answer, he said so, and when he knew an answer that damaged him, he gave it anyway. It took 4 hours. When it was over, the board chair, a woman named Helen Torres, who had been regulating commercial development in Chicago for 16 years, said something that he hadn't expected. "Mr. Holloway," she said, gathering her papers, "I've been in enforcement proceedings for a long time. I want to say one thing that's outside my formal role here. The financial issues in your company are serious, and the process will proceed accordingly. But the thing that will determine what your life looks like in 5 years is not the outcome of this proceeding. It's what you decide you are when you're not being watched for it." Grant looked at her. "I'm not sure I've figured that out yet," he said. Helen Torres looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard a great many answers to implicit questions and has learned to distinguish the honest ones from the managed ones. "That's a better answer than most people give me," she said. She left. James Ferris walked out beside Grant into the building lobby and said nothing for the length of the elevator ride and the walk to the door. Outside, he stopped. "For what it's worth," James said, "I've been your attorney for 11 years. That was the first time I've watched you walk into a difficult room and not try to control what came out of it." Grant looked at him. "How'd I do?" he said. "Honestly," James said, "better than I expected. Not good enough to avoid the consequences. But," he paused, "real. It was real." They parted on the sidewalk. Grant walked to his car alone. He thought about real. "I thought about Rebecca sitting at a table in the Lakefront Hope Foundation Gala, making one phone call with steady hands, and about the community benefit agreement she had built in 3 weeks, and the 216 public comments she had read, and the South Side Project breaking ground in 10 months, and the woman she had been becoming every day since the night he had handed her the microphone by taking his own." He got in his car. He sat for a moment. He did not feel sorry for himself. He had tried that for the first few weeks, and it had produced nothing useful. He felt instead something closer to a reckoning, the particular and irreplaceable experience of arriving at an honest understanding of yourself that nobody else can give you and nobody can take away once you have it. He had made Rebecca small because her bigness threatened him. He had called her dead weight because he was afraid of what it meant that she wasn't. He had spent 6 years with the most remarkable person he had ever known and had used every year of that time to convince himself that she was ordinary, because the alternative was admitting that the great love of his life was a woman he had failed to deserve. He deserved that. He started the car. He drove home. And Chicago in the gray November light that fell across the lake the same way it always had moved around him without pausing. 10 months after the Lakefront Hope Foundation Gala, Rebecca Whitmore stood in the cold morning air of Chicago's South Side and watched a construction crew break ground on a project that 8 months ago had existed only as 18 pages of financing documents and the word of a woman most of that neighborhood had never heard of. Marcus Webb was beside her. He hadn't said much since they arrived. He was the kind of man who processed significant moments inwardly, and this was a significant moment, and Rebecca understood that and didn't fill it with unnecessary words. She was getting better at that, at letting silence be what it was instead of managing it. The crew worked with the efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were building and why. And the foreman, a man named Jerome, who had been hired through the Riverfront South apprenticeship pipeline exactly as Rebecca had planned, had shaken her hand that morning with the grip of someone who understood that what they were part of was larger than the immediate task. "You know what my mother said when I told her I got this job," Jerome had said. "What did she say?" Rebecca asked. "She said it's about time somebody built something in this neighborhood that was actually for us." He had looked at her steadily. "She's lived here for 31 years. Rebecca had held that. She was still holding it, standing in the cold, watching the ground turn. Marcus finally spoke. "8 months ago, I told my board this deal would never close." "What made you change your mind?" Rebecca asked. "You came back with $18 million and a 10-year community benefit agreement in 3 weeks," Marcus said. "Most institutional partners take 3 months to return a phone call." "I had something to prove," Rebecca said honestly. "To who?" She thought about that. "Mostly to myself." Marcus nodded, like that was the only answer that made sense. "Well," he said, "whatever the reason, my mother's generation waited 30 years for a project like this. Yours closed it in 10 months. He paused. "That's not nothing, Rebecca." "No," she said quietly. "It's not." She stayed for 2 more hours walking the site perimeter with Jerome and the project manager reviewing the phasing timeline, answering questions she could answer, and writing down the ones she couldn't, so she could have real answers by morning rather than provisional ones by afternoon. She had learned that in the past 10 months that the specific discipline of saying, "I'll find out," rather than filling a gap with confidence she didn't have, was the most powerful professional tool she owned, because it was rare enough that people noticed it and real enough that they trusted it. She drove back to the Whitmore Holdings offices at noon. Diane had lunch on her desk and 3 messages flagged urgent, none of which turned out to be actually urgent, which was the normal ratio. One message was from Carol Whitfield, who had become over the past 10 months something Rebecca hadn't expected: a genuine friend. Not a social ally or a philanthropic connection or a professional relationship that had softened into warmth. A friend. The kind that called on a Tuesday afternoon, not because there was an agenda, but because she had seen something that made her think of Rebecca and wanted to say so. The message said, "I heard the South Side groundbreaking was this morning. I hope it was everything it was supposed to be. Lunch Thursday, I found a new place. Excellent soup." Rebecca smiled and told Diane to confirm Thursday. The second message was from Alexander, who wanted to talk about the annual Whitmore Holdings strategy review scheduled for the following month, and whether Rebecca intended to present the Community Investment Initiative's second-year plan herself or have it presented through his office. She called him back immediately. "I'll present it myself," she said when he picked up. "I assumed," he said. "I wanted to make sure you wanted the full board slot or just the committee presentation." "Full board." A brief pause. "That hasn't been done for the community investment side in 8 years." "I know," she said. "The work justifies it." Another pause, and she could hear him deciding whether to say the next thing or let it go, and then he said it. "It does. I just want to make sure you're ready for the questions. The full board includes people who were skeptical of your return. There are 3 members who voted against reinstating your executive authority." "I know who they are," Rebecca said. And if the Southside project doesn't answer their questions, I'll answer them myself." Alexander made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the same family. "All right," he said. "Full board slot. I'll have it added to the agenda." The third message was from James Ferris's office, not James himself. His assistant asking if Rebecca's legal team would be available for a coordination call regarding the finalization of the divorce settlement. The Oversight Board's enforcement proceedings against Grant had been resolved 2 weeks prior. Civil penalties, a formal repayment agreement for the misused corporate funds, and a 2-year prohibition on serving as CEO of any publicly financed development project. Criminal referral had not materialized, which Rebecca understood was partly the result of Grant's decision to cooperate fully and early and without the performance of strategic innocence. She had not felt triumphant when she read the enforcement outcome. She had felt something closer to the quiet settling of an account that had been open too long, not satisfaction exactly, but the particular relief of a thing that has been unresolved finally becoming resolved. She told Diane to confirm the coordination call for Wednesday morning. Then she opened the second-year plan for the Community Investment Initiative and got back to work. The strategy review was scheduled for a Friday in late October, almost exactly 1 year after the gala that had changed everything. The timing was not deliberate on anyone's part, but Rebecca noticed it, and she sat with the symmetry of it, the morning of the board meeting, while Diane brought her coffee, and the day organized itself around her. 1 year. She tried to locate the woman she had been 12 months ago, standing outside a ballroom because her husband had removed her name from the guest list, watching through the glass as he accepted an award for leadership while she waited to be let in. She found her. She was still there in the memory, in the specific texture of how it had felt to be standing on the outside of a room that should have had her name on the door. Rebecca didn't try to revise that memory, or diminish it, or find a framework that made it less than what it was. It had been humiliating. It had been painful in the specific way that public betrayal is painful, not just the betrayal itself, but the witnesses, the room full of people who saw you before you saw yourself clearly. And it had been the beginning of something she could not have reached any other way. She didn't believe that suffering was necessary for growth. She didn't believe that Grant had needed to humiliate her for her to become who she was becoming. She might have found her way back on her own. She would never know. What she knew was that the night it ended was also the night it began, and that both of those things were true simultaneously, and that living with that complexity honestly was better than simplifying it into a neater story. She picked up her coffee. She thought about Grant for a moment briefly, with the particular quality of attention you give to something that has genuinely mattered and is genuinely over. She had heard through the ordinary channels of a city where professional networks overlap that he was doing something he hadn't done in 2 decades, working on a small scale. A residential renovation project in Logan Square. A single building. No city financing, no institutional investors, no communications director managing his narrative. Just a contractor's relationship and a building that needed fixing, and a man who had apparently decided to start from something closer to the beginning. She didn't know whether that would be enough for him. She didn't need to know. The board meeting started at 9. The Whitmore Holdings full board was 14 people. Rebecca knew all of them by name and background and professional history. By now, she had made it her specific business in the first 6 months of her return to understand not just the business but the people who governed it, their priorities, their concerns, their histories with the Whitmore family, the places where their institutional caution was likely to show up as resistance. 3 of them had voted against reinstating her executive authority. She knew exactly which 3 and exactly why, and she had spent the past 4 months building a record that addressed each of their specific concerns without acknowledging that she knew what they were, because the most effective answers are always the ones that don't announce themselves as answers. The meeting ran through 3 other agenda items before hers. She sat through all of them with the focused attention of someone who understands that the business is larger than her piece of it, and that knowing the full picture is always worth the time. When the Community Investment Initiative came up, she stood. She presented for 22 minutes. No slides that performed polish over substance. Clear numbers clearly sourced. The Riverfront South framework and what it had produced in 8 months of implementation. The Southside groundbreaking and the financing structure, and the community benefit agreement, and what it was designed to deliver in 10 years. The workforce pipeline that connected the 2 projects and was already producing results. Jerome's crew on the South Side was 63% local hire, already exceeding the 60% requirement. She talked about what the initiative had cost and what it had returned and how those returns were measured, not just in financial terms, but in the stabilization metrics that predicted long-term value in ways that quarterly reports didn't capture. She talked about what she had learned in the 10 months since returning. She said, "I came back to this company with a significant gap in my practical knowledge, 6 years away from active management in a company that changes constantly. That gap was real, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What I had instead was something I didn't know I'd been acquiring. Perspective on what it looks like when large institutions make decisions for communities rather than with them. I spent 6 years in a position where my voice was not the primary one in the room, and I learned things in that position that I couldn't have learned from this chair. I believe those things are showing up in the work." She stopped. She let that sit. Then she said, "The second-year plan doubles the Southside workforce component and adds 2 new project partnerships in neighborhoods where we have not historically invested. The projected return is lower than our standard development portfolio in years 1 and 2. By year 5, based on corridor stabilization modeling, it converges. By year 10, it leads." She looked around the room. "I'm asking the board to commit to the 10-year view." Silence. One of the 3 board members who had voted against her reinstatement, a man named Robert Cahill, 71, old-school commercial real estate, someone who had been on the Whitmore board for 19 years and who operated on the principle that institutional patience was a virtue that still required institutional returns, leaned forward. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "the convergence modeling in year 5, what's the confidence interval on that projection?" 73% within plus or minus 8% of the projected figure, she said. "Based on comparable corridor development outcomes in Minneapolis, Denver, and Pittsburgh over equivalent 10-year periods." He looked at her. "You pulled comparable data from 3 other cities." 4. I included Cleveland. It was an outlier, so I footnoted it rather than including it in the primary model, but the data is in the appendix if you want to review it." Robert Cahill looked at the appendix. He was quiet for 40 seconds. "The Cleveland deviation," he said. "What caused it?" "A change in city administration at year 3 that reversed a key zoning commitment," Rebecca said. "The community benefit agreement we're using specifically builds in zoning protection language to address that risk. Clara Mendez's team worked on the legal structure." Another silence. Robert Cahill closed the report. He looked across the table at Alexander, who had said almost nothing during Rebecca's presentation because he understood that what was happening in this room required space more than support. Then Robert Cahill looked back at Rebecca. "I voted against your reinstatement 12 months ago," he said. "I want to be on record that I was measuring the wrong things." The room was very still. Rebecca held his gaze. "Thank you for saying that directly." "I'm going to need the full Cleveland data before I can vote on the second-year plan," he said. "But I want you to know that's a practical requirement, not a skeptical one." "I'll have it to you by Monday morning," she said. He nodded. And the particular quality of that nod, the one that comes from a person who has genuinely updated their position and is not embarrassed to show, it was one of the most significant things Rebecca had received in 10 months of significant things. The board approved the second-year plan in principle, pending Robert Cahill's review of the Cleveland data, which Rebecca delivered on Sunday evening, with an additional memo, addressing 2 secondary questions she had anticipated he would have. He approved it Monday at noon. She was in a site meeting when Diane texted her the confirmation. She read it, put her phone back in her pocket, and kept talking to the contractor about the community health clinic's interior phasing schedule because the work didn't pause for the victories, and that was exactly how it should be. The Lakefront Hope Foundation Gala fell on the 2nd Tuesday of November, as it did every year. Rebecca had known for 3 months that her name was on the program, not as a guest, not as a +1, as chair of the Whitmore Community Investment Initiative presenting, on behalf of the initiative's first-year outcomes and announcing the second-year partnership commitments to the Foundation's philanthropic network. She had known, and she had not spent a great deal of time thinking about the symmetry of it, because the work required her attention and the symmetry was incidental. The gala was the gala. It happened to be the same ballroom. She happened to be returning to it. Those were facts, not meaning. The meaning was in what she was going to do when she got there. She arrived alone. Not because she had no one to arrive with. Carol Whitfield had offered, and Alexander had offered, and her assistant Diane had made a joke about wanting to see the room where the whole thing had started. She arrived alone because she wanted to walk through those doors as exactly what she was, with no arrangement around her, no support structure visible, just Rebecca Whitmore arriving at an event where her name was at the top of the program. The registration coordinator this year was a different young woman than the one who had told Rebecca 12 months ago that her name wasn't on the list. She found Rebecca's name immediately. "Ms. Whitmore," she said with the specific warmth of someone who has been briefed on the evening's notable guests. "Welcome. You're on the program at 8:15. The Foundation Chair would like a brief word before you go on, if that's convenient." "Of course," Rebecca said. She walked into the ballroom. It looked the same. It would always look the same. The gold light, the white tablecloths, the particular sound of 500 people in a room designed to host the performance of generosity. She had thought it might feel strange to be here. It didn't. It felt like what it was, a room she was returning to, different from the last time, the room unchanged and herself completely altered. She found Douglas Farrell near the stage, and they had a brief, warm exchange about the initiative's first-year outcomes and what she planned to say this evening. And Douglas told her that the foundation had received 14 inquiries in the past 10 months from other cities asking about the Riverfront South Community Benefit Agreement model, which he said, with the particular pride of an organization that has been part of something that turned out to matter more than expected. She circulated through the room. She spoke to Patricia Chen, who had brought her deputy director, and introduced him with the words, "Rebecca is the one who got me to sign off on the workforce board pilot in 8 days, so be careful." She spoke to 3 foundation board members who had questions about the Southside project. She spoke to 2 journalists who covered the philanthropy and development beat and who had been tracking the initiative since the Riverfront South announcement. She did not look for Grant Holloway. She did not think about whether he might be there. She was simply present in the way that a person is present when they have stopped dividing their attention between where they are and where they were afraid of being. At 8 o'clock, she found a quiet moment near the east wall, the same general area where she had sat 12 months ago, with her phone and her steady hands and one number to call, and she stood there for 90 seconds with a glass of water and her own thoughts. She thought about what Margaret had said the morning after the Gala power looks very different from below. She thought about Jerome at the Southside groundbreaking and his mother who had waited 31 years. She thought about Marcus Webb reading the financing proposal for 22 minutes in silence and then extending his hand. She thought about Robert Cahill saying, "I was measuring the wrong things." She thought about Carol Whitfield saying, "I'm at an age where I've stopped waiting to tell people that." She thought about the young woman who had called her at the office 3 weeks ago, an intern at one of the nonprofits partnering on the South Side project, 24 years old, first generation in her family to work in development, who had asked Rebecca with the directness of someone who has decided that the risk of asking is worth the information she might receive. How do you walk into a room where everyone already has a chair and find a seat? Rebecca had thought about that question for a moment. Then she had said, "You stop looking for the seat they're willing to give you, and you start looking at what the room actually needs. When you bring what the room needs, the chair follows." The intern had written that down. Rebecca had watched her write it down and had felt something she didn't have a single clean word for, the particular and irreplaceable feeling of being useful in a way that reaches past the transaction. She was still thinking about that when Douglas Farrell took the stage and introduced her. She walked up the same steps Grant had walked up 12 months ago. She stood at the same podium. She looked out at the same room, and she began. "A year ago," she said, "I almost didn't come to this event." The room settled. "I was standing outside this building and I had every reason to leave, and I want to tell you what made me walk in instead. It wasn't courage exactly. It was something quieter than that. It was the specific stubbornness of a woman who had spent a long time making herself smaller in order to make someone else more comfortable, and who had finally that evening reached the end of her patience with that particular arrangement." She paused. "I walked in because I wasn't finished." The room was very still. What happened after that is a matter of record. I'm not here to revisit it. I'm here because the Whitmore Community Investment Initiative has been operating for 10 months, and I want to tell you what we've built. She told them. She gave them the numbers, clean, specific, real. The Riverfront South framework, the 55% affordable ratio, and what it meant for 800 families, the workforce pipeline, and the 63% local hire rate on the Southside project, the $18 million in structured financing across 4 sources, the 10-year community benefit agreement, and the zoning protection language, and what both of those things meant for neighborhoods that had been promised stability before and had learned over decades not to trust the promise. She told them about Jerome and his mother, who had waited 31 years. She told them about Marcus Webb's organization, which had been working for 7 years to find a capital partner willing to take the long view, and about what it had meant to both of them when the long view turned out to be available after all. She told them about the 14 cities that had requested the Community Benefit Agreement model and about the version her team was developing that could be adapted to different regulatory frameworks, and about what that meant for the initiative's reach in the next 3 years. She was at the podium for 19 minutes. When she finished, the applause was real. She stood at the top of those stairs and received it the way she had received it a year ago in this same room when Alexander had announced her return, not with performance, not with deflection, but with the honest dignity of a woman who had earned the moment she was standing in. She came down the stairs. Carol Whitfield was waiting at the bottom with the expression of someone who has been moved and doesn't intend to pretend otherwise. "That was remarkable," Carol said. "The work is remarkable," Rebecca said. "I just described it accurately." Carol laughed. "You know, most people in your position would have spent 19 minutes on the last 12 months of their personal story. You spent exactly 1 paragraph on it and then talked about Jerome's mother for 3 minutes." "Jerome's mother is the point," Rebecca said. Carol held her gaze for a moment, with the particular quality of someone who has found late in life a friendship they hadn't expected and intends to keep it. "Yes," Carol said, "she is." Later in the evening, near the end of the auction, a young woman approached Rebecca at the edge of the room. She was perhaps 26, well-dressed but not expensively, so the dress of someone who had made an effort for an event that felt important to her. She had the slightly deliberate posture of someone who has coached herself to walk across a room and speak to a person they don't know. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. My name is Jasmine. I work for a community land trust on the west side. We've been following the Riverfront South model and—" She stopped, started again. "I wanted to say that what you presented tonight, the community benefit agreement, the workforce pipeline, we've been trying to make something like that work for 4 years, and we didn't know how to structure it. And I guess I just wanted to ask—" She stopped again, slightly embarrassed by the length of her own buildup. "Ask," Rebecca said. "Could we talk sometime about how you built it?" Rebecca looked at her. She thought about herself 25 years ago, in rooms where the architecture of power felt impenetrable. She thought about the specific texture of being young and capable and certain you have something to offer and completely uncertain whether anyone will give you the space to offer it. She thought about what it had cost her over years to learn that the space was not something you waited to be given. "Yes," Rebecca said. "Have your office contact Diane Chen at Whitmore Holdings. Tell her I said to set it up within the month." Jasmine looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite relief, but was something in between that was more complete than either. "Thank you," she said. "Bring everything you've built so far," Rebecca said. "I want to see the actual work, not the summary." Jasmine nodded and turned to go and then turned back. "Can I ask one more thing?" "Yes." "People like us," Jasmine said carefully. "We don't usually get seats at tables like these." She gestured slightly at the room around them, the gold light, the white tables, the particular density of money and influence that these rooms carried. "How do you get one?" Rebecca looked at her. She thought about 12 months of mornings that started before 6 and evenings that ended after 9. She thought about Marcus Webb reading the financing proposal in silence. She thought about Robert Cahill saying I was measuring the wrong things. She thought about 216 public comments that she had read because they were the people the work was for. She thought about Jerome at the groundbreaking and Patricia Chen's deputy director and the Cleveland data appendix she had delivered on a Sunday evening because she had said she would. She thought about a ballroom 12 months ago and a phone call made with steady hands and a woman who had spent 6 years being invisible and had finally, at exactly the right moment, decided to stop. "Then we'll build a bigger table," she said. Jasmine held that for a moment. Then she nodded once with the specific nod of someone who has just received information they intend to use. She walked back across the room. Rebecca watched her go. She stayed at the Gala for another hour, working the room with the ease of someone who has made peace with the fact that this is part of the work and doing it well is its own form of service. She spoke to 3 potential partners for the initiative's 3rd-year plan. She had a 10-minute conversation with a city councilman whose ward contained one of the new project neighborhoods and who had been cautiously supportive and was becoming less cautious. She told Douglas Farrell that she would have the initiative's full 2nd-year report to the foundation board by December 1st. She left at 10:15. In the car on the way home, she sat with the quiet of the city moving past her and let the evening settle. She thought about what she had said at the beginning of her remarks, "I wasn't finished." She understood now that this was the truest thing she knew about herself. Not the Whitmore name, not the billion-dollar trust, not the executive authority, or the board approval, or the community benefit agreements that were traveling to 14 other cities. Those were outcomes. They were real, and she was proud of them, and they mattered. But the thing underneath them, the thing that had made her walk into that ballroom 12 months ago instead of turning around in the cold, that had made her pick up the phone with steady hands and say, "I'm ready to come home," that had made her read 216 public comments and deliver the Cleveland data on a Sunday, and sit across from Robert Cahill and answer his questions directly without performing a confidence she was still building. That was not the Whitmore fortune. That was not Alexander's strategic support, or Margaret's quiet belief, or the applause of 500 people in a room where her name now appeared at the top of the program. That was Rebecca. It had always been Rebecca. The woman Grant had spent 6 years making small had not needed his humiliation to become larger. She had simply needed the moment when she finally stopped accepting the size he had assigned her. She had been everything she was on the night she walked into that ballroom. She was simply finally done pretending otherwise. The car moved through the city. Chicago was exactly what it had always been: enormous and indifferent, and full of people building lives in the specific ordinary heroism of continuing. And Rebecca Whitmore was part of it now, in the way she was meant to be part of it, not as someone's wife, not as a name on a trust document, not as the punchline of a joke told on a stage by a man who had never understood what he was standing next to. As herself. Completely, unapologetically, with the full force of everything she had ever been, and everything she had earned the hard way in 12 months of starting over as herself. And that was not a beginning, and it was not an ending. It was simply the truth claimed at last, and held without apology, the way the truest things always are.